Good morning, everyone. This is zero and negative exponents. The objective is to simplify expressions involving zero and negative exponents. Okay, so let's just first talk about what an exponent is. First off, let's say we have 3 raised to the first power. That means you have 1 3 and your final answer is 3. If you'd have 3 raised to the second power, you would have 2 3's and your final answer would be 9. 3 squared, the final answer would be 9. If you had 3 to the third power, you would have 3 threes, and that would give you 27. Now, the main concept of today is what do you do if your exponent is negative, or what if your exponent is 0? Now, whenever you write a number, it can be written as a fraction. So let's say you just have the number 2. 2 really is the same thing as 2 over 1. And that's important to know because a negative exponent is going to move it's going to move up or down depending on whether you want it positive or negative. Now, in the book and for the worksheet, they really do want all exponents positive. So the example problem that you would have would be 7 to the negative 3 power. Now, the problem is this. You can't have a negative exponent. So right now, don't concern yourself at all with the 7. Concern yourself with that negative 3 power. Right now, this whole thing can be written with a 1 on bottom. So you have a numerator and you have a denominator. Now, to make it into a positive exponent, what you want to do is move it. If it's already on top, move the entire thing down. If it's already on bottom, move the entire thing up. Right now, this entire phrase is on the top. So to move it to the bottom, you would go 7 raised to the positive 3 power. It turns to a positive when you move it down. Now, you can't just leave nothing on top. You have to at least put the number 1. And then you would just take 7 times 7 times 7, get your answer, and then that would be done. If we look at the next example, it is negative 5 in parentheses raised to the negative 2 power. One thing I really want to do to show you this is you would cover up the negative 5. You could care less about the negative 5. The only thing you're caring about right now is that negative 2 power. And right now, you can write this as a fraction. You can put a 1 on bottom. So to turn it into a positive 2, you're going to move it to the bottom. Negative 5 in parentheses can now be raised to the positive 2 power if you just move it to the opposite spot of where it's at. Now, at least got to put a 1 on top. Your final answer for this one would be 1 over. And then if you take negative 5 times negative 5, the final answer for this one would be positive 25. Okay. Now, we also have to talk about 0 on this page. Anything to the 0 power is a 1. And we'll have a couple examples here. First off, let's say you just had 4 raised to the 0 power. That answer is just 1. If you have in parentheses negative 3 raised to the 0 power, that answer is also 1. If the entire phrase is in parentheses, your answer is 1. Let me just show you one that the book tries to trick you with all the time. They'll go like negative 2 raised to the 0 power. Now, this is not in parentheses. So what you do is you cover up the negative with your hand and handle the 2 raised to the 0 power first. And you know anything to the 0 power is 1. Now you throw that negative back in front of it. So the answer to this one is actually a negative 1. They really try to throw you off on this particular type of problem. Maybe one will show up later in the lesson. And then you have more examples of stuff raised to the 0 power. And here's a common example that would show up on the homework. So you got 9 to the negative 2 power. The problem is the negative 2. You should focus very little on the 9. So right now, you know it could be written as a fraction. 9 to the negative 2 power can be written with a 1 on bottom. To turn it into a positive 2 power, just move it to the opposite place of where it's at. If it was on top, move it to the bottom, and then vice versa if you need to. It would be 9 to the positive 2 power on bottom, and you have to at least put a 1 on top. Final answer for this one would be 1 over. 9 squared is 81, and this problem would be complete. As long as the entire phrase is raised to the 0 power, your answer is just 1 for this one. Now, if it would have been, and they'll do this to you here, negative 3.6 raised to the 0 power, this is a different problem here. The answer for this one would be a negative 1 because you'd cover up the negative first. 3.6 raised to the 0 power is 1, and then you have to throw that negative back in front. Okay. So letter A here. To make it into a positive exponent, you'd move it to the bottom. So you'd have 1 over 4 to the 3rd power. Your final answer would be 1 over 4 times 4 is 16. 16 times 4 is 64. There we go. Anything to the 0 power is 1, so that was a fast one. Put a 1 on top. Put a 3 to the 2nd power on bottom. 1 over 9. Oh, here's a good one. This one's a little bit different. You want to make it into a positive one, so you have to move it to the bottom. 1 over 6 to the positive 1 power on bottom, and then that would just be 1/6. And then with this last one here, you want to make it into a positive 2 power. You could care less about this number to start the problem. Don't focus on that. Just focus on the exponent. So we put a 1 on top. We leave this in parentheses, and it makes a difference. Squared. Now, when you take a negative 4 times a negative 4, you get positive 16. All right. Now, here's what happens if you add some letters into the mix. Same rules apply for letters, but here's probably the biggest tip. The 5 has its own power. It doesn't look like it does, but it does. 5 is raised to the 1st power, and since it's a positive 1, you leave it right where it's at. The A is already has a positive power, positive 3. The B has a negative 2 power, so you want to move this one. Now, you move things up or down to make them positive. So your final answer would look like this. 5 to the 1st power remains on the top. A to the 3rd power remains on the top. But to get that into a positive 2, you move it to the bottom and B squared. This is your final answer for this one. When you look at letter B, you should be focusing solely on the exponent. It is a negative 5. You want to turn it into a positive 5 by moving it up. Now, when you move it up to the top, you can put a 1 on bottom. There'd be nothing left. You can put a 1, but it'd be x to the 5th power, but most students would just put x to the 5th. All right. Oh, so real quickly here, your answer for A would be 1 over x to the 9th power. Move it down to make it positive. Letter B, you'd have to move it up. So if you move it up, it'd be n to the positive 3rd power with a 1 on bottom if you choose to. You don't have to. Now, the 4 gets its own power. 4 to the 1st power stays exactly where it's at. C moves to the bottom, becomes a positive 3. B's got a positive 1 power that stays on the top. Final answer for that one. 2 is going to stay right where it's at, and the A is going to move to the top to make it positive. On letter E, the N has to move because there's a negative power. N to the 5th. The M is going to stay right where it's at because it's already a positive 2. And then it's kind of getting to the last part here. Evaluating. You're just putting numbers in place of the variable. So you'd have 3. Using parentheses is really important on this. All right, so the numbers are in the correct spots. This negative 2 power forces it to go to the bottom. So we could rewrite it as 3 times 2 to the 3rd power is 8. We could get that done right away. Over. This is the same thing as negative 3 raised to the positive 2 power. This is a little bit more simplified. 3 times 8 gives you 24. A negative 3 times negative 3 would be 9. A little simplifying here. They both could be divided by 3. 8 over 3 would be the final answer for that one. Okay, and I'm not going to do these here because they'd be a lot more of the same, plugging these in place of the variables and coming up with your answers for these. This is the one where, again, you plug these numbers in place of the variables and come up with your answer. This is more of a calculator one, though. 1,000 times 2 raised to on the first one is 0, and then the second one would be 1,000 times 2 raised to the negative 3rd power. I mean, you know anything to the 0 power is a 1, so this is 1,000 times 1. 1,000, and then you'd move this to the bottom, so it'd be 1,000 times. If you'd move it to the bottom, it'd be 1 over 2 to the third power, and 2 to the third power is 8. Then you could finish that. And this is a lot of what the homework looks like here. Remember, focus solely on the exponent. You could care less about the number out front to start the problem. If you know that it's a negative exponent, move it to the bottom. So 1 over 2 to the 5th, and get that answer, you'd be in good shape. Anything to the 0 power is a 1. For number 3, the 5 has a power of 1, so it stays. The s squared stays, but the t has to move down because it had a negative exponent, t to the first. All right, that's it. Good luck, guys, and have a great day.